From London, the National Broadcasting Company presents War Telescope, a review of the war week and a forecast of possible developments to come. War Telescope features John McVane of NBC's London staff, a veteran reporter of the European scene. For his regular Saturday report, we take you now to London.
This is John McVane in London. I've been talking today with a man who wears Polish, French, British, and American decorations. A fighter pilot who's been taking his vacation from the Polish Air Force by flying a P-47 Thunderbolt in an American 8th Air Force squadron. The story of his career, a career that's kept him fighting Germans since September 1st, 1939, is so interesting that I've brought him to tell you all about it. It's a saga of the air, in a way, the story of Poland at war with the Nazis. Captain Michael Gladych has the 2 highest Polish decorations for valor. The French gave him the Croix de Guerre with palms during the Battle of France. 102 operational missions with the RAF as a member of a famous Polish squadron won him the British Distinguished Flying Cross. Now he's blazing out a new phase of his great battle with the American Air Force. His newest ribbon is the American Air Medal for 25 operational flights that include the 2 big American bombing raids against Berlin. But Captain Gladych can tell you all about it himself. You were a regular officer in the Polish Air Force, weren't you, Captain?
Yes. On the day war broke out, I was flying a Polish PZL-11 fighter. We were attached to a bomber group, and our job was to protect the bomber's airfield. That meant being on the alert all day. We had many combats, and we believe we shot down quite a few German planes. But the German invasion armies kept us moving our airfields, and we had no intelligence set up that could confirm our victories.
You didn't have much of a chance because you were so outnumbered. So you escaped and joined the French Air Force. Where were you stationed before the Battle of France began?
Near Paris. And then on the 11th of May, 1940, we were moved, first south of Paris, then to the front after a few days. But it was the same story as Poland. We had to keep changing our fields as the Germans advanced. We were outnumbered all the time, and we were fighting many times a day.
Were your fields being bombed often?
Very often, but the worst thing was to lose our planes in crack-ups or because of slight damage and have no replacement.
Had you any confirmed victories over the Luftwaffe?
We know we shot down many of them. But as in Poland, we had no intelligence organization to confirm them.
Where were you at the time of the armistice?
At Rochefort. Some of us wanted to go to North Africa to continue the fight. Others wanted to go to England. I admit that in those days I didn't think England had a hope. On the first day after the armistice, we were ordered to go on reconnaissance over the advancing German columns. We caught their nearest columns and strafed them so heavily we held up their advance for a while.
And how did you escape from France?
We had no gas left at the field, so we couldn't take our planes. We got aboard an English ship at La Palisse, the outer harbor. The Germans were close. We could hear their gunfire. The Polish infantry brigade was defending the town. They managed to get aboard our ship. The captain insisted on spending the night in the harbor, and the Germans came and bombed us to hell. It was the first time I had ever heard a whistling bomb, and I didn't like it. But we got a little of our own back. We had 40 machine guns, and we set them up on the ship. A Heinkel came over at first light of dawn to bomb us. We opened up with all 40 guns, and boy, we got it.
And then you came to England.
With only one shirt and no toothbrush. We formed 2 Polish squadrons, 302 and 303. Unfortunately, I missed most of the Battle of Britain because I was ill in hospital with food poisoning. In the spring of 1941, I joined 303 Squadron. We were flying our 12 Spitfires over Boulogne one day, when it used to be dangerous around Boulogne.
Mm-hmm.
We suddenly found ourselves outnumbered.
Not very pleasant.
Well, we were fighting 12 separate duels. I found 7 were after me. I got 2, but the others got me. I was bleeding badly, and 3 or 4 miles from the English coast, I knew I wouldn't make it. The last thing I remember is approaching the coast. Then I went unconscious. I came to in the hospital. I'd always treated my ship like a lady. She landed herself, hit a couple of telegraph poles, and disintegrated. But she knew her way about England better than I did. She left me 200 yards from the general hospital. I fractured my skull and spent 9 months in the hospital.
When did you start combat flying again?
Oh, I rejoined my squadron, and for 2 months I went on non-operational flights, and acted as squadron intelligence officer. They wanted to keep me as intelligence officer, and I wanted to fly, so I did both. I flew in combat, and then acted as intelligence officer after I landed. I began to get bored, though, so another officer and I declared a private war on Germans. We went strafing.
That's a volunteer job, isn't it? It's said to be pretty dangerous.
We didn't think so. I found a good target. A camp of the gunners who manned the long-range German guns on the French coast.
What did you do to it?
Well, the first time, nothing. We left England too early, and it was still dark when we arrived. We couldn't find it. We did find a little factory near the town. We got some flashlight signals and thought they meant we should attack the factory. With 2 cannon and 4 machine guns on our Spitfires, boy, we really shot it out. Then we got in some cloud and found ourselves over the middle of Le Touquet airfield with all the guns opening up on us. I was hit and flames started shooting over my cockpit. I said, "I've had it," to my wingman and told him to go home. I started over the channel. Suddenly, as dawn came, the flames disappeared. I reached base and found my exhaust pipes had been cut by cannon shells, and it was flames from the exhaust that I'd seen. Next day, we went out again. 4 of us this time. I took along a few hand grenades.
Mm-hmm.
We got separated in cloud, but 2 of us reached the German camp at dawn. I dropped 2 of my hand grenades and worked the camp up. I knew the plan of the camp very well. It was surrounded by barbed wire, and to get to the slit trenches, the soldiers had to come through in one narrow entrance. I circled, and as the Germans piled out in their underwear, I met them at the entrance. My wingman and I got the whole crowd in just the right place. We made a mess of it.
What did you do then? Get away?
Oh, no, we circled and came back. By that time, a lot of German light anti-aircraft guns were firing at us, and I got mad. They were giving us hell. We were too low. My wingman and I each picked out a gun and fixed it. It took only a short burst. We came over the camp again. We could see no one except corpses, but the guns were still firing. We both made a pass and got 2 more guns. By this time, we were flying in and out of a big cloud of smoke and dust. We came back and made our 3rd pass at the guns and got 2 more. I was hit. I could feel the plane stagger, but the engine kept running. I saw my wingman get another gun, the 7th, and he didn't come out of the cloud. I went back looking for him and called him, but couldn't find him or any sign of wreckage. That cooled me off a little. My canopy and side door were shot off, but I wasn't scratched.
That was lucky. And you got home safely?
Yes, but I got an official scolding for the strafing. I spent a couple of more months in the hospital with complications from my head injury. Then I came back to the squadron and started more strafing.
What targets did you find? Did you go back to the camp?
Oh, no. I never went back. We used to attack locomotives, water towers, planes on the ground, troops, trucks, anything we could find that would bother the Germans. I kept flying until January of this year. Then they wanted to ground me, give me an office job, because they figured I should have a vacation from flying. I didn't like that. I wanted to fly. I tried everything. I even volunteered to go to Burma, but it was no use.
How did you get in with the Americans?
An American colonel had been attached to our squadron in 1942. He was a friend of my wing commander. The wing commander was also being given a rest from flying, and like me, he wanted to fly. We got acquainted with some American P-47 pilots when we were both resting up. One of our pilots was doing acrobatics over our fields when 4 P-47s jumped him. Another pilot and I jumped in our Spitz and went up and beat up the Americans. Got on their tails. It was not hard because they'd never flown in operations and we were veterans. That is how we first became friends. Later, we visited them, explained some of the German tricks to them, and they even adopted our Polish flight formation. That was when the wing commander and I started flying P-47s with the Americans.
Well, how do you like the Thunderbolt in comparison with all the rest you've flown?
Oh, it's very good. The best I've ever flown in combat. I had a few hours on it and then started operations with the Americans. In all, I've done something like 25 missions with them. But the one I remember best is the time we were inside Germany escorting American bombers. The fight began and developed down, fairly close to the ground. I didn't get the two Germans I was after. I suddenly found three Focke-Wulfs off at right angles to me and above. I tried to jump them, but they kept away. I then went right down to the deck among the trees. They followed, and that's what I wanted. A rat race developed. They were all pretty smart. They kept shooting at me all the time. Finally, I got on the tail of one, but couldn't fire until, from a left turn, he switched to a right turn right in front of me. He was a dead pigeon. But to shoot him, I had to straighten up, and the one plane that had kept above me put some holes in my wing. I started going home because my gas was running low. The two remaining Focke-Wulfs began to fly in formation with me. They must have thought I was out of gas because they beckoned me to land. They'd fired but couldn't hit me. I motioned okay and kept flying just ahead of them until we reached an airfield on my way home.
Well, what happened then?
Oh, I knew what to do. I gave the field a short burst. All the guns in the place opened up. The two Germans were flying about 10 yards behind me. Then the first shots landed right among the two German planes behind me. I didn't stay to see whether they were shot down. I hurried for home. My Thunderbolt ran out of gas when I reached England. The cloud was 10 tenths, and I couldn't see the ground, so I bailed out. I hit the stabilizer getting out, and it set me spinning. I tried all the tricks to stop the spin before I opened the parachute, but they didn't work. At last, I pulled the ripcord. The cords of my parachute were tangled, and I thought I'd had it when I shot out of the clouds. At the last minute, I managed to straighten the cords. I was over water, but the wind took me to land. I hurt my leg on landing and sat there until a couple of British Army officers came up. They were very suspicious and wouldn't believe I was Polish.
No.
They asked me about various things, and when I mentioned the London Blitz of 1940, they said, "Were you over London in 1940 and 1941? I said, "Yes, with my Polish fighter squadron." They didn't believe me to the end. Then they said, "Well, old boy, you disappointed us terribly. We hoped you were a German."
After 7 confirmed victories with the British and 4 with the Americans, are you ready now for a rest from flying?
Not at all. The Americans have given me my own P-47. I want to keep on flying with them. And next time anyone wants to grab me, I'll ask to go to Burma and fly with the Chinese Air Force. I don't like the desk jobs.
Well, I think you certainly proved that, Captain, today. And now we return you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
You've been listening to War Telescope. War Telescope is a weekly report on the war as seen from London by John McVane. Not only is War Telescope a review of the war, but it's a forecast of possible developments to come. However, today, John McVane, veteran NBC reporter in London, had as his guest in the studio Captain Michael Gladish, Polish Air Force fighter. Captain Gladish has fought not only with Polish fighter squadrons, but American and British squadrons as well. In the interview between Captain Gladish and John McVane, the captain related his experiences as a fighter pilot. John McVane in War Telescope is presented each Saturday at the same time over most of these stations. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
London, the National Broadcasting Company presents War Telescope, a review of the war week and a forecast of possible developments to come. War Telescope features John McVane of NBC's London staff. For his regular Saturday report, we take you now to NBC, London.
This is John McVane in London. Less than an hour ago, it was announced here that a strong force of American fortresses and liberators today bombed the aircraft factories in Brunswick, Germany, and aerodromes in the northwestern part of the country. It's estimated that between 500 and 750 heavy bombers and 500 escorting fighters took part in the raid. Brunswick has already been heavily bombed, and it's probable that today's attack was chiefly to stop rebuilding in what was once one of Germany's chief centers for producing Luftwaffe fighters. Lord Beaverbrook and Mr. Burley held a news conference for press and radio representatives today. They discussed the preliminary civil aviation talks they've been holding. It was announced that both sides had to make concessions, and United States and Russian officials are going to meet, probably in Washington. Both British and Americans seem determined that no German or Japanese air carriers will be allowed to operate after the war. It was said there must be standardization of international air operations, and equality of competition must be maintained in international air traffic. I've talked about civil aviation with experts here. They believe that differences between America and Britain can be solved very rapidly. One chief problem remains for the International Air Conference of the Allies. Many nations will have a valid claim to run their own international airlines. Belgium, Holland, and France, for instance, must link up with their distant empires. Russia covers the immense stretch of the Baltic to the Pacific with her own territory, and it would seem likely that she'll take as large a part in international aviation as any of the other nations. British experts feel it would be suicidal for nations to throw all routes open to unrestricted competition, for the volume of post-war air traffic, even in the most optimistic estimates, couldn't support, say, a dozen different transatlantic lines. If that theory is taken for granted, an international air conference will have to limit the carriers on the different air routes, form the various links with the subsidiary lines, and bring order into a question that affects the entire world's communications. Without some sort of international scheme, it's thought nations would be running heavily subsidized air transport over the world's chief routes just for the sake of prestige, and whether they lost money badly or not. I've seen reports of public men at home claiming that because we built air bases in various parts of the world, we therefore have the right to keep them after the war and use them as civilian air transport terminals. It's only fair to say that the impression abroad is that we built the bases to help win the war, not as a means of extending post-war air transport. But the coming international conference will probably clarify thinking on the whole subject. You've heard the Allied air attacks on Germany and the occupied countries described as the prelude to invasion, the necessary preliminary weakening of an opponent's strength, so he'll be less able to stand up under a combined land, sea, and air attack on Western Europe. There's another kind of preliminary work that had to be done before the way to the continent could be cleared: cripple his sea power. German sea power meant two things: submarines and the two great battleships, Scharnhorst and Tirpitz. Against submarines, the combined navies and air forces of Britain and America have been waging bitter and successful war. The strength of the German U-boat packs has been broken, if not shattered completely. The resistance they can offer to invasion convoys is not important. There remain the two battleships. Hidden up in the fjords of northern Norway, they could strike northward against our convoys to Russia, or southward against the second front armada of troop transports and landing craft. In theory, a single German battleship could blow to bits a convoy protected only by cruisers and destroyers. Only battleships, her own class, could stand up and slug it out with her. You know how this preliminary work, removing the menace of the German battleships, was accomplished. How the British home fleet caught and sank the Scharnhorst a few weeks ago. How last fall, British midget submarines crippled the Tirpitz with torpedoes and put her out of action for months. But those winter months of darkness, gales, and snow blizzards made further attacks impossible, and covered repair ships slipping up through the Norwegian islands. The Tirpitz had to be kept out of action especially at the crucial moment of invasion. You've heard that British naval aircraft, many of them made in American factories, took on the great job of keeping the Tirpitz out of the war. Today, I've brought Commander Anthony Kimmins of the British Navy, who was on one of the aircraft carriers, to give a first-hand impression of the action. Commander, why was the decision taken to use naval planes flying from aircraft carriers rather than, say, midget submarines again, or land-based bombers?
Well, midget submarines couldn't be expected to succeed a second time. You see, they depend on sheer impertinence, audacity, and complete surprise. The enormous distance from the North Cape, the northernmost point in Europe, ruled out the use of shore-based heavy bombers. No, the only answer was naval dive bombers and fighter escorts operating from aircraft carriers.
What kind of weather did you meet?
On the day of the attack itself, the weather was unbelievably good. But during the first part of the passage up north, and way up into the Arctic Circle, the weather got colder and bitterer every day. When the wind flow over the flight deck is a 40-mile-an-hour snow blizzard, and the spray breaking over the forecastle is freezing before it touches down. Those flight deck parties on an aircraft carrier have one of the toughest jobs imaginable. The pilots sighed with relief when, just before dawn on the day they were to attack, they found perfect conditions, calm sea and a clear sky with patches of cloud. On the flight deck, engines roared. The carriers and the escorting ships were all heeling over, swinging into the wind. As a steam jet up in the bows, to show when the ship is dead into the wind, was opened up, lumps of ice shot into the air, went slithering down the flight deck, got whirled up in the propeller slipstreams, and was sent cracking against the flight deck crews, clinging to the wingtips and lying on the deck, tending the chocks. The planes roared away over the bows one by one. Nearby, you could see the same thing going on. British Fairey Barracuda dive bombers, used for the first time in action, Seafires, and the American Vortsikorsky Corsair and Grumman Wildcat and Hellcat fighters.
I expect they made quite a sight forming up over your head.
Indeed they did. The sky seemed filled with them, all heading for Norway. As they gained height and crossed the coast, the sun was rising to their left, shining across the snow-covered mountains, throwing shadows into the gorges and against the snow-covered trees in the valleys, and lighting up the deep blue of the calm fjord. Down to the left were 2 or 3 enemy ships, but these took no visible interest in the proceedings. Everything seemed calm and peaceful. But I'll bet that up at the far end of the fjord, alarm bells were ringing, fat-headed Huns were falling out of bed, rubbing their eyes and cursing the British as they threw on some clothes and stumbled out to their cold action stations.
Did the aircraft meet any opposition?
No enemy fighters came up. But as they neared the target, a flagship further out in the fjord opened up, but rather raggedly, and without any great effect. And then, as they crossed the final ridge, there, nestling under the sheer mountains, in the narrow fjord, lay one of the largest battleships in the world, the Tirpitz, a dark wisp of smoke coming up from her funnel. Up till then, the strike had kept dead radio silence. Now, a sudden rasping noise hit them in the ears. The leader had switched on. Then a shout. All fighters anti-flak. Leader over.
How did the attack begin?
Hellcats and Wildcats literally fell out of the sky. As the Barracudas hurtled down, they could see the fighters strafing the surrounding gun positions and whistling across the Tirpitz, with the traces from their bullets bouncing off her deck. Green and red tracer came racing up, but the fighters had entirely disorganized her AA fire, and the Barracudas were able to take perfect aim. Down they went with their eyes glued to her funnel. 6,000, 5,000, 4,000. They went down so fast that anything loose shot up to the roof of the cockpits. Now the leader was at the right height, and he let go. The first 3 bombs went whistling down, exploding bang on her bridge, the nerve center of the ship. The other pilots, diving from either side, were close in his tail. One extra large bomb, bursting through the armor plate amidships, went off with a terrific explosion between decks. The huge ship shuddered, her stern whipping up and down and sending waves across the fjord. You know, the whole attack was so beautifully synchronized, so beautifully timed, that it was only 60 seconds, just 1 minute, from the first bomb to the last.
Did the second attack come in fast?
As the first strike weaved away and made off down the valleys, with fires raging in the Tirpitz and the artificial smoke cover belching out from all around her, they saw above them the second strike coming in from the sea. Admittedly, the artificial smoke and the smoke from the first strike's explosions helped guide them to the target. But by the time they got over, the whole fjord was almost completely obscured, with a strong box barrage above the smoke. But luckily, at the critical moment, the smoke cleared over the Tirpitz, and with a shout of joy they roared down, carrying out similar tactics and doing probably an equal amount of damage. Again, there were many hits. One heavy bomb in particular was seen to crash through the upper deck and explode with a sheet of flame that reached above the topmast. The cloud of smoke going up to over 1,500 feet. And by the time the last pilot dived, the AA fire had ceased.
And so naval aircraft, in a few minutes over the target, left the Tirpitz crippled once more.
Yes. And as we steamed south for home and messages of congratulation came pouring in, you know, I couldn't help thinking of a small group in a German prisoner of war camp. The crews of those midget submarines. I'll bet when they hear the good news, they'll get a bigger kick than anyone.
And I'll bet they'll get a real thrill out of it, Commander. Thank you for telling us the story. I said that the British naval aircraft helped accomplish a preliminary phase of the invasion, wrecking German sea power. There's another phase of invasion that's also of vital importance, the cooperation of the underground forces in the occupied countries. President Roosevelt is reported to have mentioned recently the difficulty of knowing the opinion of the people inside France. In the light of this, it may be interesting to know some of the ideas of an extremely intelligent Frenchwoman who arrived here recently. Unfortunately, she doesn't speak English, so I couldn't bring her today to the microphone. Madame Aubrac was the heroine of the exploit you probably heard about. She rescued her husband from the Gestapo while he was on his way to execution. She led a group of the men of the Marquis and only came out of France because she was about to have her second child. It was born 2 or 3 days after she reached England. Madame O'Brock is less like your idea of a gunwoman than anyone you could meet. She looks like what she is, an intelligent schoolteacher. She emphasizes that for the great bulk of the patriots, life must be lived on two planes, the secret and the open. While they're sabotaging and working against the Germans and their Vichy assistants, most of them are also living quite ordinary lives so the Germans don't suspect them. Madame O'Brock, for instance, was a teacher. When she came in the morning and found some slogan like Vive de Gaulle chalked on the blackboard, she tried to find and punish the child who'd done it. Her efforts and her scoldings were cover for her own far more important activities. They satisfied officials that she was what she seemed to be, an ordinary schoolteacher, most interested in keeping her job. She fought openly among the men of the Marquis before she came to England, but that was after she'd rescued her husband from death. The resistance movements, she says, are extremely well organized now. The communists played the largest part at the very beginning, for they were the best organized for underground warfare. Now, however, they make up only 20 or 30% of the resistance organizations. Madame O'Brock thinks that's a fair indication of their importance in post-war France, but she doesn't believe that even the communists think France will become communist. The resistance movement has become highly integrated within France, and Madame O'Brock says they all recognize the French committee in Algiers as the present government of France, but there's no adulation of General de Gaulle. The resistance movements regard him as the symbol of France's fight for freedom and as the head of the government, but she laughs at the idea of France accepting de Gaulle as a dictator. Only a tiny handful of Frenchmen are now convinced collaborators of the Germans. Some of the big industrial class who collaborated with the Germans are now worried about the future. In some cases, however, big industrialists, whom she named, have remained staunch patriots, working against the Germans while putting up an outward show of collaboration. Some of the high Vichy officials, she thought, are trying to contact the Allies as a method of saving their own skins. But Madame O'Brock says they're leaders without troops and represent only themselves. One point she brought out was that the Catholic Church in France is strongly anti-German. At the beginning, the Church supported Pétain as the avowed proponent of ancient Catholic virtues. At least 2 years ago, however, the Church, under the influence of the Jesuits and Dominicans, realized that Vichy had failed. Since then, the bishops and archbishops, as well as the parish priests, have exerted strong influence against the Germans and on behalf of the new French Republic. Madame O'Brock noted especially the way Catholic Church authorities had opposed German and Vichy persecution of the Jews. This is John McVeigh in London, sending you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
You have been listening to War Telescope, a weekly report on the war as seen from London by John McVeigh, NBC's veteran observer in the British capital. Mr. McVeigh is presented each Saturday at this time over most of these stations. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Each Saturday afternoon at this time, the National Broadcasting Company brings you the War Telescope from London. You'll hear NBC's observer in the British capital, John McVeigh, in an interesting discussion of developments of the war. So now to London to see what Mr. McVeigh has in store for us. Come in, John McVeigh in London.
This is John McVeigh in London. As the hour and the day of invasion come closer, signs of increased tension are becoming more visible in Britain. The people are living on two planes. One is the round of daily work. On that plane, nerves become irritated more quickly than usual. People do their jobs, work hard at them, but always with a feeling that everything from now on will be a kind of marking time until the day when the assault begins. You might compare it to what a boxer does with his time on the day of a championship fight. He's done his training. Nothing will be really important now until he jumps from his chair under the arc lights when the bell sounds for the first round. Meanwhile, he must spend the day going through the motions of eating, sleeping, and diverting himself. But always he knows that life will again seem important to him only when the seconds step out of the ring and he stands facing his opponent with his whole future at stake. For the people of Britain, life on the second plane consists of looking forward to the coming operations, wondering about them, speculating, hoping, confident that when the attack begins, daily life will again take on significance and meaning. I think it's partly from this feeling of suspended existence that it's been responsible for the wave of strikes in Britain. Bus drivers and conductresses in London declare their jangled nerves can't stand more trips per day on the summer schedule, so they strike for a few days, then drift back to work. Gas company employees on strike in Manchester leave housewives with gas cookers facing the prospect of no hot meals over the weekend. The coal strikes in recent weeks have reached serious proportions.
A series of strikes can't be condoned at such a time and isn't by any important body of opinion in Britain. But the fact that they do occur is one manifestation of invasion nerves. From a certain amount of knowledge of the British, I'd guess that when operations do begin, there'll be no strikes in this country. Invasion nerves are discernible in the government's methods of dealing with the problem. Government spokesmen have been inclined to blame it all on the sinister activities of a few hundred British Trotskyites. At present, there's a great hue and cry about them, for a day or two played up in the London papers on strictly thriller lines. A new defense regulation, drawn up with the consent of the trade unions, has been aimed at the Trotskyite agitators. Yet this is all a crude simplification, a surface attempt at dealing with a deep problem. The Trotskyites are undoubtedly guilty of doing as much as they can against the war effort. But their efforts would be unavailing if second front nerves and the fact that real grievances have been allowed by the government to trail along for years without settlement didn't create the conditions favorable to such unofficial strikes and stoppages. Invasion nerves have shown up even in royal quarters here. Only thus can be explained the statement I heard young King Peter of Yugoslavia make this week to the effect that all the aid the Allies had sent his people wouldn't suffice to equip even one battalion. I can't recollect any time in history in which a monarch cooked his own goose so quickly in a single sentence. Peter evidently meant only Mihailovich and his Serbs when he referred to my people. For thousands of tons of weapons and equipment have been sent to Marshal Tito. It was the first time in public, then, that the king proclaimed himself as only the king of Mihailovich's dwindling force instead of the king of all Yugoslavs. In fact, if you were betting on the future of the Yugoslav monarchy, something more than a good outside chance might be given to the possibility of a tie-up between Tito and the monarchy in the person of one of King Peter's younger brothers. But even though Britain can give examples of war nerves, constructive work is being done that will help international understanding and cooperation. I heard Representative Fulbright yesterday explain the work that the Allied Educational Reconstruction Group is doing. Mr. Fulbright believes that in the cooperation of bodies like UNRWA and his committee are being laid the foundations of political cooperation in the post-war years. The education group will rebuild the wreckage of education in the occupied countries, get classes going, provide teacher training, textbooks, paper, pencils, to make possible training for citizenship of children of our allies after they've been liberated. Such schemes are hopeful for cooperation possible in such varied types of activity as the Second Front, education, and yesterday's statement about international currency should point the way to cooperation in other fields after the war is over. On these War Telescope broadcasts, you usually hear men with some special knowledge discuss some particular phase of the war. Today I'm going to do something new. Introduce two of the men who'll be part of NBC's European invasion team. They've just arrived in London from New York and Washington, and their first impressions of life in Britain at this crucial moment would perhaps be your impressions if you'd had the chance to make the trip. You'll hear both of these men many times in coming months. One you've heard often in the past year, broadcasting from New York. He is W.W. Chaplin, veteran foreign correspondent and author of the book 70,000 Miles of War. He's been to Russia, India, and Cairo, but this is the first time he's been to Britain since September 1939, the first month of the war. The voice of the second will be new to you. He's NBC's war correspondent accredited to the U.S. Navy, George Wheeler. He's been a broadcasting executive in Washington, and this is his first trip to Britain in wartime. Now, to begin, what do you fellows get as a first impression of Britain in these pre-Second Front days? What do you find that's different from September 39, Bill?
Well, of course, John, the most obvious difference is the number of Americans here. It's a little hard for me to realize even yet that this is England, because there are so many Americans here. That's the first impression I had, the first change, and next? Well, the next change I noticed was the result of the bombing, and that came to me only gradually. I got to London at night, during an alert, incidentally, and drove to a hotel through blacked-out streets, deserted except for people who have very special and very important duties at such times. Next morning, there seemed to be very few changes. The city as a whole is just the same. The barrage balloons still look like great gray snails climbing slowly up the wall of the sky. Enough of the old landmarks to give an impression of business as usual. It was quite suddenly that it came to me that big gaps in rows of buildings didn't indicate new construction. planned and prepared for by the intentional removal of old buildings. This was bomb damage, the debris neatly swept away. When I was here last, no bomb had yet fallen on London. As I've walked around the streets in the past couple of days, my eyes have already become educated. There are many changes in London.
Does that jibe with your impression, George?
Yes, it does, John. From just a quick look, you might get the impression that the bombing wasn't as severe as you'd supposed. But taking into account the ability to rebuild and repair, the surest indication of the beating that London has taken is the absence of window glass. Many, many blocks have their sightless eyes for reminders, whereas in other respects they may appear completely untouched.
Well, what do you think are the most outstanding characteristics of life in London at the moment?
Well, I've been struck by the contrast between the very old and the very new. Tradition existing beside advanced economic and sociological thinking. Fine old buildings beside modern architecture.
The thing that struck me first and hardest is the general feeling of calm confidence. It wasn't that way in 39. It wasn't that way at all. War had just been declared. No one knew what was going to happen in any next minute. But they were quite ready to believe it would be something awful. Children were being evacuated from the big cities. Everyone was carrying gas masks at all times. Even waiters in restaurants wore them, strapped on behind like a bustle while waiting on table. Well, it isn't like that now. After all, this home front has been a very active war front for a long time.
You mean people don't have to wonder about what sort of things may happen?
That's it, John. They've been through everything that can happen to a home front, and they know all the answers. So they just go on about their business, calmly, confidently, completely unafraid. To me, it's more than reassuring. It's really inspiring.
Do you think this British attitude has had its effect on our people here?
I think it must have had. Confidence and calm are just as contagious, just as catching as are hysteria, bewilderment, and the jitters of any kind. Certainly, even the little time I've been here has been long enough to show very plainly that our folks here aren't suffering from any kind of jitters. And I think the British attitude must have been a big help to them when they were getting settled in.
I've been noticing a lot of little things. For instance, I'm noticing the papers proposing a share the ride scheme for taxi cabs. And it's a little amusing, because we've been doing that in many American cities for a long time. Another thing, rationing is much more complete here than at home. The ordinary man doesn't seem to be as affected by inflation as his counterpart in the States. As long as he keeps living an ordinary life, he's all right. It's when he wants to kick up his heels that he feels the pinch.
But even the ordinary man has to pay 50 cents a pack for his cigarettes, George. And I think you'll get a shock when you go to the movies and have to fork over a couple of dollars a seat. But, Bill, were conditions here any different from what you expected?
Yes, they were, John. I'd expected to see things generally changed a lot more than they are. I thought the people would be changed more by what they've gone through. I thought all the physical hardships, the war taxation, the rationing, all that sort of thing, I thought it would show more on the surface. Actually, it hardly shows at all on the surface.
What's your first impression of the American Army over here, Bill?
Well, of course, I really haven't had a chance to see much of it. Nothing of it in the field. But to judge just from what you can see in London, I'd say that our army here is an army ready to go. Certainly the morale is tops, and I'm told the degree, the perfection of training is just as high.
You came over with the Navy, George. What's that angle?
Well, I got a wonderful kick out of the way men who were once bankers and butchers and beer salesmen have pitched in with the regulars. As an American, it made me pretty proud to see the way they're doing the terrifically complicated business of running convoys and fighting ships.
Any incidents you remember in particular?
Well, I can't say much, of course, but there was one story that I think's worth telling. It was the story of a colored mess attendant. He used to spend all his spare time studying up on plane recognition, silhouettes, and that sort of thing. One of the officers heard about him and decided to give him a test. The final exam for experts consisted of identifying silhouettes shown on a screen in a darkened room for only a 50th of a second. This colored mess attendant quietly identified 100 out of 100. They set the machine to 100th of a second per flash. The mess attendant's average fell to 95 out of 100. Then, half apologetically, he proceeded to give the nationalities and general types of the remaining 5 planes. And now when the bosun's whistle sounds all hands to general quarters, that slight, shy steward's mate is not a mess attendant anymore. He's assistant to the gunnery officer for the whole ship.
Pretty good. He's a lucky man to have eyes like that. Speaking of ships, what do you hope to do covering the Navy in the invasion, George?
Well, I hope to get wherever and whatever there is of naval action and record it on the spot, John, at sea. I've been experimenting with the up-to-the-minute recording device. We hope to rush these recordings away and broadcast them home as quickly as is humanly possible.
What about your trip over here, Bill? Your first sight of Britain, an American air base, that sort of thing.
Well, John, I'm really not sure just how much I can say about things like that yet. You always have to find out the ground rules in each new theater. But certainly I can say that I came by air in one of the big planes of our Air Transport Command, and that it was a very nice trip. Not so much as a bump, all the way from Washington to the place we landed, somewhere in the United Kingdom. You asked about an American air base. The only one I've seen so far is that place we landed. And I guess all I can say about that is that it was impressive, very impressive. If everything over here is as smooth as that air base, and I understand it is, well, then I can understand why the German radio is having such a case of high-temperature invasion jitters as it is right now.
And I shouldn't be surprised if Nazi high temperature got higher still before it's over. Thank you, Bill Chaplin and George Wheeler. This is John McVane returning you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
And so ends another of NBC's War Telescope broadcasts, a regular weekly presentation from the NBC newsroom in New York. During today's program, you've heard John McVane, NBC's observer in London, presenting W.W. Chaplin and George Wheeler, NBC's newly arrived observers in London. This is the National Broadcasting Company. Over in the British capital, replacing John McVane for today's broadcast, this is the War Telescope. And now overseas to the British capital and Bill Chaplin. Go ahead in London.
This is W.W. Chaplin in London. The American planes based in Britain have been out again today, bombing targets, destruction of which will make invasion easier, less costly in life. The German radio says one of those targets was Berlin. We haven't any official word yet on today's bomb tonnage, but you know how it's been running during this pre-invasion blitz of ours. Sometimes almost 5,000 tons in a single day, as much as 20,000 tons in 1 week. And it goes on and on every day. Have you ever wondered where in the world all those bombs come from? How they get from the production line to the plane? Who's responsible for seeing to it that they're there? Well, that's what I'm going to tell you on this War Telescope program today. Or rather, what I'm going to ask the man who's responsible for it all to tell you. To tell you about the bombs and a lot of other things vitally needed all the time by your men who are already in combat, and which will be needed by the undoubtedly far greater number of men who will be in combat when the big day comes. Here in the studio with me is one of our American generals. I don't recall that he's been in the headlines. He probably won't be. But it's quite possible that he'll be in the history books, credited with a man-sized share of winning the war by a job of organization that simply staggers the imagination. Our guest on the War Telescope today is Brigadier General Henry B. Saylor, Chief Ordnance Officer in the European Theater of Operations. General Saylor, will you please tell us first what our fighting men get from ordnance?
They get all their guns, all their ammunition, all their motor-driven equipment. It's our responsibility in ordnance to see they have those things when they need them and replacements as they go along.
So it's a lot bigger thing than just the supply of bombs that I spoke of. Supplying those bombs is a big job, but it's just one of almost countless jobs for ordnance. Rolling stock from jeeps to tanks. Weapons from great railroad guns right down to the paratrooper's Tommy gun. Ammunition for everything. General, how is it humanly possible to keep our men supplied with all those things? I mean, how will it be possible after the invasion is underway?
That's just what I came over here 2 years ago to find out. That's been my assignment from the moment I arrived in England. We've built up a big organization. We've had fine cooperation. I can safely say now that we're ready. Of course, the job never ends. The problem of keeping the flow of weapons and ammunition and vehicles coming across the Atlantic is a constant one. But it's a problem we know how to handle now.
And how big is your organization over here, General?
I can't give you figures on that, for obvious reasons. But I can say that the ordnance organization in this theater is larger than that and in any other theater, including the Mediterranean.
Well, General, will you explain this? Of course, we know that, by and large, our men have the best equipment in the world. And, of course, they'll go into action from here fully equipped. But equipment does use itself up, especially ammunition. How do we know that our men are going to find reserves, replenishment of material on hand when they need it?
It's a business of ordnance to see they have it. Ordnance teams go right in along with the landing parties. Reserve equipment starts right in along with the combat troops and keeps right on coming in after them.
And that, of course, means boats. Does ordnance control motor transport at sea as well as on land?
No, that's a Navy job. We deliver equipment to one beach and pick it up on the other side. Getting it across water is Navy. That's one of the things I had in mind when I spoke of cooperation. The whole plan is worked out as one plan as to how much space goes to ordnance in comparison to space for men and other materials. Then the Navy furnishes that space in the ratio required.
Yes, but suppose something like this should happen. Suppose after the landing has been effected, the men are on shore, the fighting has begun, then suppose a storm comes up that might delay transport across the channel. Is there any chance that those landing parties might use up all their ammunition before reserve supplies could be delivered? That would put them at the mercy of the enemy.
No, I don't believe that could happen. That's been guarded against. You remember I told you of ordnance teams going in right along or right after the combat waves. Well, they take enough material right with them to keep the fighting men supplied through any conceivable lag thereafter. It's been very carefully worked out, and you can be sure that when conditions call for firing on the enemy, all our men will have the proper weapon at the proper moment and plenty of the proper ammunition to use in it.
Well, that certainly is good news, General. Now, how about the heavy stuff? The tanks, the self-propelled guns, all the big field cannon. How about those? Some of those are inevitably going to get knocked around some, or just plain worn out. How about replacing them?
That's all arranged for, too. Take tanks, for instance. Say a tank moving inland is knocked out of action by artillery fire or a bomb. Well, we're notified, and we go right in there with a brand new tank on a big trailer. We turn that tank over for use, and we put the inactive tank on the trailer and haul it back to the beachhead. And back there, and this will be done in a surprisingly short time after the first landings, we'll have repair crews all set to put that tank back into working order. There'll be mobile repair units almost immediately. And very soon, regular fixed repair bases. The same plan will be used for all combat units. And you spoke of guns wearing out. Well, they do under heavy firing conditions, of course. So we have teams that go right along with the artillery and keep testing every gun. Before any barrel is shot out, a new gun is ordered up. So when the old gun is released for repair, the new one is all ready to take up the job.
That is certainly all very interesting, General. Now, I think that I've asked enough specific questions. Won't you tell us now something that you yourself would like to explain to the folks at home? I know that Mrs. Saylor is listening in Washington, and you'd probably just rather tell her about your life over here. But right now, please think of all the families and friends of the men who are going to be fighting on the continent. And tell those folks something of the way your branch of the service is going to help those men. Perhaps something of the way you feel about your job, about this terrific responsibility you have as Chief Ordnance Officer for the European Theater of Operations. You take the microphone, General, and tell them how it looks to you.
The Ordnance Department is supplying our invasion armies with everything that shoots, with every type of bomb and blockbuster, and everything that rolls from bicycles to tanks. It is supplying some 2,300 separate major combat items and more than 350,000 different kinds of spare parts that are needed to keep all these items in first-class repair. The job of storing all this, of knowing where each item is, and of being ready to furnish battle equipment and replacement parts is a gigantic, never-ending responsibility. Ordnance includes the shells and charges that feed all the weapons, machine guns, cannons, and includes the incidentals necessary to the operation and maintenance of this tremendous firepower. Ordnance also includes the powder charges, the fuses, the tools, the lubricants, and the optical and control instruments. Our armed forces must have weapons of tremendous range and firepower, and weapons that will shoot under any conditions. They come from the engineering skills and production techniques of American industry and the Army Ordnance Department. This industry ordnance team is a powerful, efficient, and effective adjunct to American fighting men. This industry ordnance team strives to make the job at hand for these fighting men easier and speedier. The ordnance slogan, Armament for Victory, through the cooperation of American industry and Army ordnance, is the backbone of our industrial strength at home and of our military strength on global battlefields at this hour. In conclusion, I would like to extend a word of high praise to Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee, Deputy Theater Commander, European Theater of Operations, to Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr., the U.S. Army Chief of Ordnance, and to the very able men with him who have worked tirelessly to make certain that the American soldier is the best equipped fighting man in the world. Major General Gradium M. Barnes, Chief of the Technical Division, Office Chief of Ordnance. Major General Tom Hayes, Chief of the Industrial Service, and Brigadier General Julian S. Hatcher, Chief of Field Service of the Army Ordnance. Truly, Ordnance will keep them rolling and shooting. Thank you, Mr. Chaplain.
And thank you, General. We've had the privilege of listening today to Brigadier General Henry B. Saylor, the Chief Ordnance Officer of the European Theater of Operations. I think what he's just told us is one of the most reassuring statements we've had so far in connection with the forthcoming invasion. What his talk has told us, in a nutshell, is that there's no reason for any of us to lie awake at nights having nightmares about our men caught on the field of battle without full and constantly replenished weapons and ammunition and all the tools with which to defend themselves. That has happened in other wars, in other armies, but General Saylor has spent the past 2 years of his life seeing to it that it won't happen to our army in this war. And he says it won't. Goodness knows those fighting men are going to have it tough enough. It's very good to know that every piece of equipment they need will be ready to their hand when they need it. So they can drive the enemy hard and get this whole business over with just as quickly as is humanly possible. And get back to their home and to you. That's what the General's told us, so I'm sure you all join me in thanking him for bringing us this message today. Thank you, sir. And now we have time for just a few words on the spot news of today. And the spot news today, like most days lately, deals very largely with the invasion. Especially, almost entirely, in fact, the news from Germany does. You remember that about a week ago, they were guessing the invasion would begin this month. Well, they haven't canceled that guess yet, and tomorrow's the last day there is in this month. And right today, German garrisons in the Jutland area of Denmark, they were issued standby orders for our invasion. According to reports reaching us through Stockholm from neutral Sweden, a high state of alarm was declared in that part of Denmark. That's just about the same as a state of siege. So the Germans apparently still feel that their guess about April invasion may still be right. We naturally aren't denying or confirming. We're just keeping quiet and letting the Germans do the worrying. And anyone who doesn't keep quiet enough is dealt with very forcibly. Just today, a woman who was a temporary government employee here was sentenced to 3 months hard labor. She's pleaded guilty to violations of defense regulations. Violations caused by careless talk. This is W.W. Chaplin returning you now to the NBC newsroom in New York.
And so, with that report on the war from W.W. Chaplin, NBC staff man in London, we put away the War Telescope until next Saturday at this same time. Each week, members of our London staff present special guests in this program of Sidelights on the War. Today, W.W. Chaplin presented as his guest Brigadier General Saylor, Chief of Army Ordnance in the European Theater. Telescope was a presentation of the NBC News and Special Events Department. This is the National Broadcasting Company.